Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Dear listeners, before we get started, drop a quick hi in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you have any suggestions for us to make the channel better, please let us know. Now let's start with the story. The burgundy dress hung in my closet like a ghost of better times. I'd worn it to Abigail's high school graduation, then to her college commencement, and later to celebrate her first promotion at the marketing firm. Each time she'd complimented how elegant I looked, how proud she was to have me as her mother. Now, as I smoothed the fabric over my 62-year-old frame, I wondered if this would be the last time I'd dress up for my daughter. 3 weeks had passed since our explosive argument about her wedding budget. $65,000. That's what Abigail and her fiancé, Harrison, had demanded I contribute. Not asked, demanded. As if my late husband's life insurance money, the nest egg I'd carefully preserved for my retirement, was somehow their birthright. I could still hear her words, sharp as they'd struck. "Mom, you're being selfish," she said, her voice clipped, almost cold. "You're sitting on all that money while we're trying to start our life together. Don't you want me to be happy?" I had tried, truly tried, to stay calm, to reason with her. "Abigail," I had said, keeping my tone measured, "happiness doesn't come from imported Italian marble in a powder room or a honeymoon on some island halfway across the world." She didn't budge. "We're not being unreasonable. It's one wedding. Don't you think your only daughter deserves something special?" I had offered $15,000. It was more than generous. Enough for a beautiful local ceremony. But when she looked at me, looked through me, really, with that mix of contempt and calculation, it had nearly broken me. I barely recognized her. Not the girl who used to bring me fistfuls of dandelions from the yard, call them sunshine flowers, and beam when I tucked them behind my ear. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the phone rang. I was in the garden behind the duplex I'd moved into after Howard passed. The air smelled of mint and tomatoes. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered without checking the caller ID. "Mom." Her voice. Different. Softer. Like she was speaking through a crack in a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. "Yes, Abigail. I've been thinking about what you said," she began. There was a pause, pregnant, uncertain. Maybe we've both been too stubborn. Could we talk over dinner? I want to work this out." I closed my eyes, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly. "I'd like that, sweetheart," I said. I was already thinking of what I'd make. Maybe that rosemary chicken she liked, or the butternut squash soup Howard used to say made the whole house smell like fall. But then she said, "Actually, Harrison and I thought we'd take you out somewhere nice. You know, that Italian place on Meridian Street. Franco's, where Howard had taken me for our 25th anniversary. Where the tables were intimate and the lighting soft enough to hide the tears I suspected we'd both shed as we found our way back to each other." Now, as I applied my lipstick with the steady hand of a woman who'd learned to present strength even when she felt brittle, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe Abigail's pregnancy had given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized that family meant more than extravagant weddings and social media-worthy celebrations. The drive to Franco's took me through the neighborhood where I'd raised Abigail and her older brother Mitchell, past the elementary school where I'd volunteered in the library, helping little hands turn pages and discover words, past the park where I'd pushed her on swings until my arms ached, her laughter echoing across the green, past the community center where, in heels too high and a dress too tight, I taught her to waltz before her first formal dance. Each landmark felt like a page in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to close. Franco's looked exactly as I remembered. The warm brick facade, the window boxes overflowing with late autumn mums, the soft glow of candlelight spilling through gauze curtains. I checked my watch. 6:30, exactly. Abigail had always appreciated punctuality, a trait she'd inherited from her father. Inside, the hostess, a young woman with kind eyes and a practiced smile, greeted me. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes. Under Shaw," I replied. She scanned the list, then smiled and gestured. "Right this way, ma'am." She led me to a corner table tucked away from the noise of the bar. There, Abigail was already seated. She looked radiant in the way only pregnant women can, her skin glowing, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore a designer dress I didn't recognize. Silk, probably. Something that cost more than 2 months of my grocery bills. "Mom." She rose quickly and stepped toward me, arms outstretched. I returned the embrace, breathing in her familiar perfume, floral, delicate, the same she'd worn for years. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the familiar surge of maternal love that had defined my life for 34 years. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I said as we sat. And I meant it. Whatever our differences, whatever pain lay between us, she was still my daughter. She offered a soft smile. Thanks, Mom. How are you feeling? Any morning sickness? I asked, watching her reach for her water glass. Better now, she said, touching her belly with a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The second trimester is supposed to be easier. I nodded. I remember that with Mitchell. I could finally eat without gagging. She chuckled softly. Yeah, Harrison's relieved I can finally stand the smell of coffee again. I didn't say anything to that, just smiled politely. Harrison should be here any minute, she added, glancing at the door. He got held up at the office. Harrison Shaw, 36, ambitious, charming when it suited him. He worked for a commercial real estate firm and walked with the confidence of a man who'd never heard the word no and believed everyone else's purpose was to applaud him. I tried to like him, tried to find what Abigail saw in him beyond the expensive suits and the dismissive tone he reserved for waitstaff and cab drivers. But it had been difficult. I'm glad you called, I said gently, settling into my chair and folding my napkin across my lap. I've missed you. Something flickered across her face. Was it guilt? Regret? I couldn't be sure. Something had moved across Abigail's face, a flicker too fast to name. But before I could examine it further, Harrison appeared at our table. Not alone. He was followed by 3 men in dark suits, each carrying a briefcase. The atmosphere changed immediately. My pulse quickened. Mrs. Marlowe, Harrison said, his smile too bright, too practiced, as if he'd been rehearsing it in the mirror. Thank you for joining us. The men took seats around our small table without waiting to be invited. The space that had been set for an intimate dinner now felt like a boardroom under siege. My stomach tightened. This wasn't coincidence. This was a production. Choreographed. Deliberate. I turned to Abigail, keeping my voice level. Abigail, who are these gentlemen? She didn't look at me. Mom, these are some colleagues of Harrison's. Her voice was steady, too steady. But her eyes, she still wouldn't meet mine. They have some paperwork they'd like you to look at. Paperwork. A silver-haired man with a predator's smile leaned forward slightly. His cologne was sharp and expensive. I'd worked for men like him for decades. Mrs. Marlowe, he began smoothly, I'm Raymond King, Harrison's attorney. We've prepared some documents that we believe will be beneficial for everyone involved. His words clung to the air like smoke. I could feel the heaviness pressing in around me, same as I had 3 weeks ago when Abigail first made her demands. But this time, the anger didn't come. Something colder did. Something that had taken root in the quiet weeks since. Bitter, still, and cutting. What kind of documents? I asked, though I already knew this wasn't going anywhere good. Harrison cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Abigail before addressing me. It's really quite simple, Mrs. Marlowe. We're asking you to sign a power of attorney that would allow us to manage your financial affairs. My lips parted, but I didn't speak. Given your age, he continued, and the fact that you're living alone now, it just makes sense to have someone younger handling your investments, your property decisions. My age, I repeated quietly, cutting him off. I stared at him. I'm 62, Harrison, not 92. Of course, he said, holding up a hand as if to soothe me, his tone suddenly laced with false humility. But you have to admit, these things are complex. Real estate markets, investment portfolios, it's not something you should have to worry about. I looked at Abigail then, my daughter, waiting for her to say something, anything, to show that this wasn't what it looked like. But she sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the table. Raymond King reached into his briefcase and pushed a manila folder toward me. If you could just sign here and initial there, he said, tapping the spaces with a pen, we can get everything squared away tonight. I opened the folder, fingers steady. Inside, exactly what I'd expected. Power of attorney documents that would hand over control of everything. My accounts, my home, Howard's life insurance. Every piece of what we had built together, scraped together over 4 decades. I took a breath. And if I don't sign? I asked, my voice calm, steady, a tone I'd mastered in boardrooms full of men who thought me fragile. Abigail finally looked up. What I saw in her eyes chilled me more than anything Harrison or his lawyer had said. Not anger, not guilt, not love. Cold, calculating, final. Then you won't see your grandson grow up, she said simply. It's your choice, Mom. But I think you should know that Harrison and I have been talking to a lawyer about grandparents' rights. Apparently, they're quite limited, Abigail said, her tone cool, composed, especially when the grandparent has shown a pattern of being difficult. The restaurant seemed to fade around me. The soft jazz music, the gentle clink of glasses, the low murmur of other diners enjoying their evening. All of it became white noise, pushed to the edges of my awareness. I stared at my daughter. This woman I had carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood fevers, stayed awake beside during long nights of broken hearts and science projects, cheered on at dance recitals and graduations. And I tried, truly tried, to understand when exactly she had become a stranger. I see, I said quietly. My hand went into my purse, not in panic, but with purpose. Past my wallet, past my reading glasses, past the small photo I'd carried for years, Abigail and Mitchell at the beach, toes in the sand, arms around each other, beaming. I found my phone. The weight of it grounded me. I scrolled through my contacts, the names a blur until I saw the one I needed. Mom. Abigail's voice had shifted. There was uncertainty in it now, the first crack in her resolve. What are you doing? I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. One ring. Two. Hello? Came Mitchell's familiar voice, steady, concerned. It's Mom, I said. I need you to come to Franco's restaurant. On Meridian Street. A pause. Now. Yes, I know it's late. I know you have work in the morning. Just come. I hung up before he could ask any more questions, before the emotion caught in my throat could betray me. I set the phone gently beside the manila folder on the table. I think, I said, my voice calm, my gaze locked on Abigail, that before I sign anything, someone wants to say a few words. The silence that followed stretched long and thin, like a taut wire strung too tight. Harrison shifted in his seat. His polished confidence began to peel at the edges, like paint too hastily applied. The three lawyers exchanged glances, not panicked, but alert. Predators realizing the prey was not quite as docile as they'd expected. Mom, Abigail said, and now the wheedling tone was back, the same one she'd used as a teenager when she'd wanted the car keys or money for some trip she wasn't supposed to take. There's no need to involve Mitchell in this. Isn't there? I folded my hands in my lap. They felt remarkably steady. Because it seems to me that when you bring three lawyers to what you called a reconciliation dinner, you've already involved quite a few people. Raymond King cleared his throat. Mrs. Marlowe, he said, with a lawyer's polished gentleness. Perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Family matters can be emotional. Can they? I said, fixing my gaze on him. How thoughtful of you to notice. 23 minutes. That's how long it would take Mitchell to drive from his apartment downtown, if he hit the lights right. 23 minutes to navigate this minefield. 23 minutes to keep breathing in a space that felt like it was tightening by the second. Harrison leaned forward. That salesman smile pasted right back on his face like armor. Look, Mrs. Marlowe. Abigail. Then, correcting himself quickly, may I call you Abigail? I didn't move. You may call me Mrs. Marlowe. The smile cracked. Of course, Mrs. Marlowe, he said, readjusting his tone. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to help you manage your assets more efficiently. You know, Harrison continued, his tone slipping into that polished cadence he used when he thought he was being persuasive. Maximize your returns. Make sure you're positioned well for retirement. I see. I nodded slowly. And how much would this help cost me? I looked directly at him. I'm sorry, your help managing my assets. What's your fee? The lawyers stirred, subtle, but unmistakable. A shift in posture, a flicker of attention, the scent of blood. But I wasn't the one bleeding. Not tonight. Harrison's jaw tightened, just for a moment. A crack in the mask. There would be some administrative costs, naturally, he said, aiming for casual. But really, this is about family. About making sure Abigail and the baby are secure. The baby. I turned to Abigail, who was suddenly preoccupied with studying her nails. Not chipped, not bitten, perfectly manicured. Her hands were steady. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine. Tell me, Abigail, I said slowly, when exactly did you start planning this evening? Mom, I don't know what you mean. When did you call Harrison's lawyer friends? I asked, keeping my voice even. Before or after you called me about reconciliation? She lifted her chin then, and for a moment, I saw Howard, his stubborn streak, reflected back at me. But it was twisted now, worn down to something cold and unfamiliar. Does it matter? It matters to me. Fine. Her voice cracked slightly on the word. We've been discussing options for weeks. Ever since you made it clear that you don't care about my happiness or my future. Options. I turned the word over in my mind, found it bitter. Is that what we're calling extortion now? It's not extortion. Abigail snapped, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby tables. It's family. It's what families do for each other. I stared at her. What families do, I said quietly, is support each other without lawyers and ultimatums. One of the younger attorneys, mid-30s maybe, with a nervous energy that radiated from his bouncing knee, leaned forward. Clearly not as seasoned as King, and not nearly as composed. Mrs. Marlowe, if I may, he began, his tone overly careful. You should know that grandparents' rights in this state are quite limited. If your daughter chooses to restrict access to her child, your legal recourse would be. Excuse me. The voice came from behind me, calm, warm, familiar. Mitchell. He stood tall beside our table, still in his hospital scrubs, hair mussed from what had clearly been a rushed drive. At 37, my son had grown into a man who carried himself with his father's quiet strength and his grandmother's discerning eyes. Eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Dr. Johnson," he said to the table, though his gaze lingered, cold and steady, on Harrison. "I believe you called me, Mom." "I did." I gestured to the chair the hostess had just placed. "Mitchell, I'd like you to meet your sister's colleagues." His eyes moved slowly across the table, taking in each detail, the folder, the body language, the tension hanging between every word. "Colleagues," he repeated, his tone flat. "I see. And they are." Harrison stood up quickly, extending his hand. "Harrison Shaw, your sister's fiancé. These are some business associates of mine. We were just discussing some financial planning with your mother." Mitchell shook Harrison's hand briefly, then sat down, deliberately, not once acknowledging the lawyers. "Financial planning," Mitchell said, raising an eyebrow, "at Franco's, on a Tuesday night, with Abigail 3 months pregnant." He turned his gaze to his sister. "How are you feeling, by the way? Any complications?" "I'm fine," Abigail replied, but her voice was smaller now, more uncertain than it had been all evening. "Good. That's good." Mitchell reached for the manila folder. He flipped through the pages with the calm, practiced hand of someone used to sorting through medical charts and consent forms at 2 a.m., someone who'd seen plenty of legalese and hospital protocol packets. He paused, eyes scanning the fine print. "Power of attorney," he said, his tone neutral but his brow furrowing. "Interesting." He looked up. "Mom, did you ask for help managing your finances?" "I did not," I said firmly. He closed the folder and set it aside like it was contaminated. "Harrison, Abigail, gentlemen," he said, his voice even. "Would you mind giving me a moment alone with my mother?" Harrison began to protest, puffing up with the indignation of a man whose plan wasn't going as smoothly as anticipated. "Now, wait just a minute. I'm not asking," Mitchell said, his voice low and surgical, honed from years of giving bad news with unflinching clarity. It cut through the air like a scalpel. Precise. I watched the lawyers stiffen, suddenly unsure of their footing. Harrison looked at Abigail, waiting for backup. But she was staring down at her hands again, her mouth a thin, tight line. "We'll be right over there," Raymond King said, gesturing toward the bar area. "Mrs. Marlowe, please don't make any hasty decisions." They stood and stepped away, leaving their drinks behind. The bar swallowed them up in a warm buzz of laughter and music, but at our table, silence fell like a curtain. Mitchell leaned in, his elbows on the table, his voice soft now. "Mom, talk to me. What's really going on here?" For the first time that evening, I felt the thread of tears rise, but not from sadness. From relief. From the overwhelming comfort of being seen. Not as a bank account, not as an obstacle, but as a person, as his mother. "They want me to sign over power of attorney," I said, my voice low. "Abigail says if I don't, I won't see my grandchild." Mitchell was quiet, his fingers drumming a familiar rhythm on the edge of the table, left, right, pause. A pattern I remembered from nights at the kitchen table, when he'd wrestle with math homework or the workings of the human heart. Always thinking, always steady. "How much did they ask you for originally?" he asked. 65,000, I said. He let out a low whistle. "And you offered?" 15, which is more than generous." He nodded. Slowly, his eyes drifted to the bar where Harrison was waving a hand, clearly mid-explanation to the attorneys who now looked considerably less confident. "Mom," he said, turning back to me, his expression serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Are you having any problems?" he asked gently. "Memory issues? Confusion? Anything that might make them think you need help managing your affairs?" I almost laughed. Almost. But nothing about this situation was funny. "Mitchell," I said, "last month I balanced my checkbook to the penny. I renegotiated my car insurance to save $200 a year. And I caught an error in my property tax assessment that saved me $800. He didn't even blink. He just nodded once. "Does that sound like someone who needs financial management?" I asked. "No," he said, jaw tightening. Not the kind of tension that came with frustration, but the deep, slow-burning kind that I'd only ever seen in his father when he witnessed something truly unjust. "It sounds like someone who taught her son how to manage money so well that he graduated medical school with minimal debt." His voice was thick now, laced with something more than anger. "Gratitude. Loyalty. I worked for that," I said softly. He met my gaze, unwavering. "I worked for it because you taught me the value of work. You showed me how to sacrifice for what matters," Mitchell said, his hand still over mine. His eyes drifted toward Abigail, who sat across the restaurant, watching us. Her expression was blank. "What happened to her, Mom?" he asked quietly. "When did she become this person?" It was the question that had haunted me for months, maybe years. When had Abigail's ambition curdled into entitlement? When had her dreams morphed into demands? When had her love become something that only extended as far as my checkbook would reach? I don't know, I admitted, my voice low, aching. Maybe I protected her too much. Maybe I made things too easy. Or maybe I glanced toward the bar, toward Harrison, who was pacing slightly as he talked on his phone, one hand slicing the air with sharp gestures. Even from this distance, the calculation in his body was obvious. The way he took up space, the way he positioned himself to dominate a room without ever raising his voice. Maybe Harrison happened to her. Mitchell followed my gaze, frowning. You think he's behind this? I think, I said, watching Harrison with cool detachment. He's a man who sees an opportunity. Mitchell gave a slight nod, then looked back at me, his fingers tightening around mine. But I also think Abigail is 34 years old. She's responsible for her own choices. That landed like a stone in my chest. Heavy. True. The question is, he said, gently, what do you want to do about it? Before I could answer, movement at the corner of my eye pulled my attention. Harrison was already striding back toward our table, his expression blank but brisk. The lawyers followed like a well-dressed pack, papers and pens in hand. And behind them came Abigail, slower, one hand resting on her belly in a gesture that felt, by now, either protective or performative. I could no longer tell the difference. I'm sorry to interrupt, Harrison said, his voice smooth, entirely unapologetic. But we do have a timeline we're working with. The wedding is in 3 months, and there are vendors who need deposits, venues that need to be secured. Of course, I said, rising slowly from my chair. I adjusted my purse strap, made sure my phone was within easy reach. Timeline. How thoughtful of you to mention that. The restaurant pulsed around us with the quiet comfort of ordinary life. Couples sipping wine. Friends laughing over linguine. Birthdays celebrated with sparklers and cannoli. Normal people, living normal lives. At table 12, though, something far less normal was taking place, a family being dissected with the sterile precision of a scalpel and a signature. I've made my decision, I said, loud enough for all of them to hear. Abigail's face froze. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I smiled. The same smile I'd worn to PDA meetings when teachers underestimated other people's children. The same smile I'd perfected over 40 years of marriage to a man who sometimes tested my patience but never once tested my loyalty. I'll sign, I said. The transformation was immediate. Relief swept across Harrison's face like a tide, so visible it was almost laughable. Raymond King exhaled and even managed to smile. Abigail's posture softened, the tight lines in her shoulders loosening as she reached instinctively for her water glass. But first, I added, reaching into my purse and pulling out my phone, there's someone else who wants to say a few words. Their smiles faltered. I scrolled calmly through my contacts, my thumb steady. I found the number I'd added just 2 weeks ago, right after Abigail's first ultimatum. A whisper of intuition had warned me then. This dinner might not be what it claimed to be. Lillian, I said when the familiar voice answered. It's Abigail Marlowe. Yes, I know it's late. Could you come to Franco's restaurant on Meridian Street? Bring the documents we discussed. I ended the call and set the phone gently on the table. Harrison's expression morphed, from relief to confusion to something much closer to alarm. Who is Lillian? He asked, voice a touch sharper now. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply watched, observed how a single phone call, a calm voice, and a refusal to be cornered shifted the entire energy of a room. The lawyers were whispering among themselves now, their confidence bleeding out in hushed tones and darting glances. Abigail sat stiffly, looking from Harrison to me, and back again, a tremor of unease spreading across her features like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Lillian Quinn, I said pleasantly, folding my hands. My attorney. The silence that followed wasn't like before. It was heavier now, denser. The air around the table thickened as the weight of the shift settled in. This wasn't negotiation anymore. It was reckoning. Raymond King's smug expression had evaporated. Gone was the practiced, predatory smile. In its place, sharp-eyed calculation, the look of a man suddenly aware he'd stepped into a snare. Your attorney. Harrison echoed slowly, his brow tightening. When did you hire an attorney? The same day you started asking my neighbors about my mental state. I replied evenly, watching the flicker in his eyes. Did you really think Mrs. Anderson wouldn't mention a nice young man stopping by, asking whether I'd been acting strangely lately? Forgetting things? Making poor decisions? Abigail went pale. Her mouth opened, but she hesitated. Mom, we never. You never what, sweetheart? I asked, keeping my tone light, even maternal. Never had Harrison drive past my house taking pictures from his car? Never had him chat with my mailman about whether I'd been paying my bills on time. She flinched. Never had his friend from the real estate office pull comps on my house. I went on to see what it might be worth if, say, it hit the market under duress. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth, when it's steady and undeniable, doesn't require volume. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, and I saw the moment he began putting it all together. The rapid-fire calculus of a doctor diagnosing something rotten beneath the surface. Jesus, Abigail, he said, shaking his head slowly. How long have you been planning this? It's not what you think, she muttered, but there was no force behind it. Her voice lacked conviction, like even she no longer believed what she was saying. Isn't it? I asked. I opened my purse and removed a small manila envelope, slim, tidy, and filled with a quiet kind of ammunition. Because I think it's exactly what it looks like. A systematic attempt to establish grounds to have me declared incompetent. I spread the contents on the table with deliberate care. Photographs Harrison had taken of my home from various angles. Printed emails between him and a private investigator. Inquiries into my medical history, banking habits, daily routine. Even a list of my prescriptions. Lillian has been very thorough, I said, not without pride. It's amazing what people will tell a private investigator, especially when that investigator looks like someone's sweet grandmother. The youngest of the lawyers, the jittery one who hadn't spoken much, was now visibly sweating. He tugged at his collar, eyes flicking to Raymond, then to me. Mrs. Marlowe, he said weakly, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our client's intentions. Oh, I understand the intentions perfectly, I replied coolly, gathering the papers back into a neat stack. The question is whether you gentlemen understood what you were being asked to participate in. 12 minutes later, punctual as always, Lillian walked through Franco's front doors with a sense of calm command that turned heads even in a place as elegant as this. Petite, silver-haired, and sharply dressed, she moved with the confidence of someone who'd been through this exact circus before and had shut it down every time. At 70, Lillian had the kind of no-nonsense presence that made even seasoned attorneys blink. She paused at our table and gave Abigail a polite smile that somehow managed to be both warm and withering. Abigail, she said smoothly, taking the seat Mitchell pulled out for her. And this must be your daughter. The contrast hit like a thunderclap. Where I had once been isolated at this table, surrounded, scrutinized, pressured, Lillian's presence flipped the balance entirely. I wasn't alone now. I was reinforced. Supported. Harrison and his lawyers suddenly looked smaller. Outnumbered not just by bodies, but by people who actually understood the law and weren't impressed by expensive suits or smug smiles. Lillian turned to the group with the calm detachment of a surgeon preparing to address an especially tricky growth. Gentlemen, she said crisply, her gaze sweeping the table, I believe you have some documents you'd like Mrs. Marlowe to sign. Raymond King cleared his throat. This is really a family matter, Ms. Quinn, Raymond King began, trying to recover the ground that was quickly crumbling beneath his feet. Lillian gave him a tight, polite smile. Lillian, of Quinn, Peterson and Associates. And you're quite right, Mr. King. This is a family matter. Which is precisely why I'm here, to ensure that Mrs. Marlowe's family relationships aren't being manipulated for financial gain. With the grace of someone who'd done this dance many times before, Lillian unclasped her briefcase and removed a thick folder. The sound of the metal rings snapping open cut through the tense air like a gavel falling in court. Now, she said calmly, flipping through the documents, before we waste any more breath discussing power of attorney, I think it's only fair you see what Mrs. Marlowe has already put in place. She laid the pages out in front of them, pristine, stamped, bearing the raised seal of the county courthouse. I didn't look at Abigail or Harrison. I looked at the papers, at the black and white proof that I was not, and would never be, anyone's fool. Harrison leaned in, his brow furrowing as he scanned the titles and clauses. His eyes flicked across the signatures, the official stamps, the unmistakable finality of the language. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by understanding, then a growing shadow of panic. Lillian folded her hands over the edge of the folder. Irrevocable trust. She explained as if we were simply chatting over tea. Established 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Marlowe's assets, her home, her retirement accounts, her life insurance, even the royalties from Howard's patents, have all been transferred to the Abigail Marlowe Family Trust. That's, Harrison started, then stopped. The words caught in his throat like he'd swallowed something sharp. His legal vocabulary suddenly failed him. That's what, dear? Lillian asked sweetly, her voice silk-wrapped steel. Abigail leaned over, reading the document behind him. Her mouth moved silently, eyes tracing the fine print until she found what she was looking for. The beneficiaries are your children, she said slowly. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Both born and unborn. I nodded. With Mitchell as trustee until they each reached the age of 25. The words landed like a slap. I watched Harrison's face as he did the math. No access. No control. No easy path to the money he'd been so sure was within his reach. But what about the wedding? He blurted, desperation breaking through his carefully constructed facade. What about our expenses? What about them? Lillian said coolly, arching one perfectly plucked brow. The trust provides for educational needs, medical care, and reasonable living expenses for the beneficiaries. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms. I don't see how imported Italian marble for a bathroom qualifies as any of those. This is ridiculous, Harrison snapped, his composure unraveling now, thread by thread. Abigail, tell them. Tell them we had an agreement. Mitchell turned toward her. Did you? He asked quietly. Did you have an agreement, Abigail? Or did you have demands, backed by threats? Abigail's lips parted, then closed. She looked around the table, at Harrison's furious face, at the lawyers already shrinking into their suits, at Mitchell's calm disappointment, at Lillian's unshakable calm. And then her eyes landed on me. I'm pregnant, she said softly. As if that explained everything. As if that excused everything. I softened. Just a little. Just enough to remember the girl who once brought me finger paint drawings of our family on butcher paper. And your child, I said gently, will be provided for. Better than you can imagine. I laid a hand over hers. The trust will pay for the finest education, the best care, every opportunity a grandparent could want to give. But Harrison, I looked across the table, will not have access to a single penny of it. You can't do this, Harrison said, his voice rising with the urgency of a man watching his payday vanish. Abigail is your daughter. You can't cut her out of your will over a wedding. I'm not cutting her out of anything, I said, my voice steady. I'm protecting her inheritance from you. Lillian smiled at that. A slow, deadly smile I imagined had made more than one opposing counsel sweat through their jacket. Mr. Shaw, she said smoothly, turning to him, you may want to consult your own legal representation. Because I think you may need independent counsel regarding the implications of your documented investigation into your fiancé's mother's medical history, real estate holdings, and personal finances. The words fell into the silence like thunder. Harrison's head whipped toward Raymond King, eyes wild for an out. But the older man was already sliding his documents back into his briefcase, careful and deliberate. I think, King said carefully, not looking at anyone directly, that we may have been operating under some misunderstandings about the nature of this situation. Perhaps it would be best, Raymond King said, clearing his throat again, if we postponed any document signing until everyone has had time to consult with their respective counsel. Excellent idea, Lillian said, standing smoothly, her briefcase already closed and in hand. Mrs. Marlowe, shall we go? I think you've accomplished what you came here to do. I stood slowly, not rushing, not needing to. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of what had just unfolded settle like fine dust over the wreckage left behind. The table, once set for reconciliation, now sat like the aftermath of a battlefield. Wine glasses untouched. The manila folder, now meaningless. Eyes wide, mouths drawn tight. Abigail was crying. Silent tears. They slipped down her cheeks, leaving dark trails of mascara. Maybe they were real. Maybe they weren't. I couldn't tell anymore. Worse, I realized, I no longer cared to. Abigail, I said softly. She looked up, and for a second, there was something in her eyes that looked like hope. Like she still believed this might be fixable. That maybe this was just another one of our fights. When you're ready, I said, my voice steady, to have a real conversation about this baby, about your future, about what family actually means, you call me. But you call me alone. I didn't wait for her response. I turned to Harrison. He was staring at the trust documents with the helpless rage of a man who'd just watched the vault door slam shut. As for you, I said, letting every year of my 62 resonate in my tone, stay away from my family. Stay away from my house. And if I hear you've made one more inquiry about my mental state, my money, or my mailman, Lillian and I will have a very different kind of conversation. One involving harassment and elder abuse. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Just air. Mitchell rose beside me, pulling out his wallet and placing a few crisp bills on the table. Abigail, he said, not unkindly but with unmistakable finality, if you need somewhere to think, you can come to my place. But you come alone, and you leave the financial scheming at the door. We left then, walking through the warm hush of Franco's, past tables of normal people having normal evenings, people who would never know that, at table 12, a woman had just wrested back her autonomy. As the door swung closed behind us, I heard Harrison's voice rising again, arguing, pleading, justifying, something about fairness, about rights, about how none of this was how it was supposed to go. His voice faded behind us, swallowed by the hum of the city, the gentle wind, the vast indifference of the universe. Outside, the air was cool, clean. Lillian turned to me. "How do you feel?" I paused, the weight of the moment pressing in, not heavy, just full, like something that had been held too long had finally been set down. Inside that restaurant, my daughter was probably trying to salvage her relationship with a man who had seen her not as a partner, but as a shortcut. And Harrison, he was learning, maybe for the first time, that some women cannot be bought, bullied, or broken. "Free," I said quietly, for the first time in months. "I feel free." Lillian nodded once, sharply, like a general after a clean victory. "Good. Now comes the hard part, deciding what you want to build with that freedom." 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen, the morning sun spilling through the blinds, painting the linoleum floor Howard and I had laid down ourselves 23 years ago. The light caught every groove in the pattern. Flaws I once saw as imperfections now seemed like character. History. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt quiet, peaceful. There was a difference I was learning, and that difference mattered. The coffee pot hissed and sputtered. I poured 2 mugs, the scent of dark roast curling through the air, familiar and grounding. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Punctual. I'd come to appreciate punctuality even more since Franco's, since I'd learned the value of people who say what they mean and do what they promise. "Right on time," I said, pulling the door open to find Janet Waters standing there with a covered casserole dish in her hands, and that look on her face, the one that meant she had something juicy she couldn't wait to tell me. "You brought provisions." She grinned. "Cornbread. My grandmother's recipe. And I heard something interesting at the grocery store yesterday." Naturally, Janet had become something like a quiet miracle in my life. 2 days after the debacle at Franco's, she'd knocked on my door with a smile and a plate of cookies, introducing herself as my new neighbor. A widow like me, recently moved into the duplex next door after saying goodbye to the house where she'd raised 4 children. 67, whip-smart, and brisk in the way only women who've lived through both heartbreak and joy can be. She didn't pry. She didn't preach. She simply showed up, with stories, casseroles, advice when asked, and the kind of calm presence that made you feel less alone in your own home. I didn't know how I'd gotten so lucky, but I wasn't questioning it. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She made herself at home like she always did, placing the casserole on the counter and settling into the kitchen chair that had become unofficially hers. I poured 2 mugs of coffee, served in the mismatched porcelain cups we'd picked out together on one of our Saturday wanderings downtown, part of what Janet called my reclaiming project. "You going to make me beg?" I asked as I handed her her mug. She chuckled. "Harrison Shaw was at the bank yesterday." I sat across from her, already smiling. "Apparently," she continued, blowing on her coffee, "he was quite upset. Something about a few accounts being frozen." "Oh," I lifted an eyebrow, affecting only mild interest, though my spine straightened just a little. "Seems his business partner found some irregularities in their escrow records. Client funds being redirected." She took a long sip of coffee. "Word is, the board's involved. He might be facing some professional difficulties." Janet's eyes twinkled, the sparkle of someone who's seen karma roll in like an unexpected thunderstorm, and loved every minute of it. I didn't gloat. Not out loud. Inside, though, I allowed myself the smallest curl of satisfaction. Since that night at Franco's, I'd come to appreciate how beautiful it was when the world corrected itself without you having to lift a finger. All you had to do was wait and keep your receipts. "And Abigail?" I asked, bracing myself. "She's shopping for dresses. Discount ones." Janet's mouth twitched. "Outlets in Greenville. Apparently, the Italian marble has been downgraded to ceramic tile. Renovations on hold." I couldn't help it. I laughed, short and dry. It wasn't schadenfreude exactly. More like release. A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For a while we sat in a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Children passed outside on their way to school, birds chirped, and a distant lawn mower kicked into gear. Life, ordinary and undramatic, continued. Janet glanced over the rim of her cup. "Heard from Mitchell yesterday," I said. "He said Abigail called. Asked if he thought she was making a mistake." Janet raised her brows. "What did he say?" I smiled faintly and set down my cup with care. He told her that was a question only she could answer. "Smart boy." I looked out the window, catching the glint of morning sun on the dew-damp grass. "Smart man," I corrected. "He gets that from his father." The phone rang, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had become my body's automatic response to unexpected calls. Even now, weeks after Franco's, weeks after Lillian dismantled Harrison's little operation like it was her weekend hobby, that sensation hadn't gone away. Not entirely. I glanced at the screen. A local number, but not one I recognized. No name attached. Mrs. Marlowe. The voice was young, female, and trying not to sound nervous. This is Diana Reed from the Meridian Community Center. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, I said, already feeling Janet's eyes on me from across the kitchen table. She gave me that little half-smile she wore whenever something interesting was brewing. How can I help you? Well, this might sound strange, but we heard about your situation from Lillian Quinn. She mentioned that you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities. That piqued my attention. I straightened a bit, setting down my coffee cup. What kind of opportunities? Diana hesitated, like she wasn't sure how much I already knew. We have a program for seniors who are dealing with financial exploitation. Families, caregivers, people they trust trying to take advantage of them. Lillian thought you might be uniquely qualified to help. I looked across the table at Janet. She raised her eyebrows slightly and nodded like she was hearing exactly what she'd hoped. The irony wasn't lost on me. My own daughter, trying to rob me blind in a dimly lit Italian restaurant, might become the catalyst for helping someone else avoid the same fate. Turning poison into medicine. That's what it felt like. Tell me more, I said, settling into my chair. For the next 20 minutes, Diana walked me through the program. Seniors helping seniors, sharing resources, telling their stories, teaching others how to spot red flags before it's too late. A hybrid of advocacy and support. Legal tips. Emotional backing. Informal, yes, but meaningful. It's coffee and conversation, mostly, Diana said. But we've helped a lot of people avoid situations like what Lillian described. I'll think about it, I told her, though I already knew I would go. I was already imagining myself in a room of people who understood what it meant to be betrayed by your own blood. People who wouldn't look at you like you were a fool for trusting your children. When I hung up, Janet didn't say anything at first. She just sipped her coffee and waited. Finally, she gave me that knowing look again. You're going to do it. It wasn't a question. Probably, I said. Good, she replied. You need something that's yours. Something that has nothing to do with being someone's mother or grandmother, or someone's mark. I nodded, quietly grateful. It was exactly the right thing to say, in exactly the tone that didn't make it feel like a lecture. Janet understood what I hadn't even put into words yet. This wasn't about reinvention. It was about reclamation. About taking back the parts of myself I'd been too busy giving away. That afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, the number I knew by heart. Mom, Mitchell said. Without preamble, I just wanted to give you a heads up. Abigail's been asking questions about the trust. Specifically, whether there are any ways to modify it. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she had. I told her that irrevocable means irrevocable, he continued, but she seems to think there might be loopholes. There was a pause. She mentioned something about undue influence, he said slowly. About Lillian pressuring you into decisions you might not have made otherwise. I felt a familiar stirring of anger, but it was different now. Cleaner. More focused. Not the helpless rage of someone being ambushed. Not the heat that comes when your own child weaponizes love, but the purposeful irritation of someone whose boundaries were being tested again, and who now knew exactly how to hold the line. Let me guess, I said, keeping my voice even. Harrison's idea, probably. But Mom, Mitchell hesitated, and I heard the tightness in his throat. She's the one making the calls. She's the one who chose to pursue this. I know. I did know. Finally. Completely. Whatever spell I had been under, whatever illusion that Abigail was still the little girl who needed me, the young woman who listened to my advice, the daughter who brought me flowers on Mother's Day just because, was broken now. She was an adult. A woman who had made adult choices. And those choices had consequences that extended beyond wedding budgets and bathroom renovations. There's something else, Mitchell said carefully. She asked if I thought you'd change your mind if she ended the engagement. My breath caught for a moment, not because I believed it, but because I knew exactly what it meant. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her, he said slowly, that decisions motivated by money rarely lead to happiness, but also that her relationship with Harrison wasn't really my business. He paused. I could hear him choosing his words with care, the way he always did when something mattered. I also told her that if she wanted to repair things with you, it would have to start with an honest conversation about what she'd done and why she'd done it. And she hung up on me. I closed my eyes. Not in pain. There was no pain left for Abigail. Just acceptance. Each call, each maneuver, each manipulation she'd attempted over the past month had only confirmed what I already knew, that my daughter, the girl I had raised with bedtime stories and piano lessons and homemade lunches, had become someone I didn't recognize, and that protecting myself from her choices was not cruelty. It was survival. Mitchell, I said softly, I want you to know, whatever happens with Abigail, it doesn't change anything between us. You're a good man, a good son, and I'm proud of the life you've built." He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was thick. "Mom, I keep thinking I should be able to fix this somehow. Mediate. Find some middle ground. Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart," I said gently. "Some things can only be accepted." After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, letting my hand trail along the walls, the furniture, the edges of rooms I'd known in every season of motherhood. But I was looking now with new eyes. The living room where Abigail used to play with her dolls, where she'd later brought boyfriends, asking in that casual tone if I liked him, while watching my face for clues. The kitchen where I taught her to make pie crust from scratch, where she'd first confessed that she was in love with Harrison, and later announced their engagement over glasses of wine I now remembered drinking too quickly. The hallway lined with family photos. A gallery of frozen time, smiling faces, birthday candles, school dances, anniversaries. But it didn't feel warm anymore. Not nostalgic. The photos seemed like documentation of a story that had ended. But endings, I was learning, were also beginnings. Tomorrow, I would call Diana Reed and volunteer for the community center program. It felt like the natural next step, not as retaliation, but as restoration, as reclamation. Next week, Janet and I were driving to Nashville. She'd always wanted to see that folk art exhibit at the museum, but her husband never liked long car rides. "Maybe next year," he used to say. But now, she was free to go. And so was I. Next month, Lillian and I were meeting to discuss starting a financial literacy program for women my age, women who'd been good mothers and faithful wives, but who'd never once had full access to their bank passwords. The future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted road. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious about where it might lead. There would be other dinners, other conversations, other opportunities to choose dignity over desperation, wisdom over wishful thinking. The burgundy dress still hung in my closet, silent, waiting. But I was already imagining other clothes, other occasions, other versions of myself I had yet to discover. The woman who'd walked into Franco's 3 weeks ago had been someone's victim. I can admit that now. She was tired, uncertain, still clinging to the illusion that love could outweigh manipulation. But the woman who walked out that night? She was something much more dangerous to people like Harrison Shaw. She was someone who could not be moved. 6 months later, I stood in the Meridian Community Center's main hall, the chairs scraping softly against the wax tile floor as 12 women and 3 men arranged them in our usual circle. I watched them with quiet pride. This group, my group, was no longer a collection of broken stories. We were becoming something new. Maxine Mikowski, 72, and still wearing her high school track coach whistle on a lanyard like it was armor, moved briskly, placing chairs just so, correcting a crooked one without a word. Rosa Pratt Kelly, barely 60, but with the heavy steps of someone who'd been mother, mediator, and financial lifeline to a son who couldn't stay out of a casino, set out the tissues at the center of the circle. Always tissues. A small, practical kindness for those who didn't yet realize they'd need them. "Abigail's here early tonight," Janet murmured beside me. She eased herself into the folding chair that had slowly, over weeks in conversations and shared silences, become hers. I followed her gaze. A woman, maybe 55, sat near the door, gripping her purse like it might bolt from her hands. Her outfit was tasteful but just slightly out of step, an older designer bag paired with shoes that had seen better days. Hair carefully styled, but the faint shake in her fingers told the truth. The shoulders, too, rigid, high, like she'd spent the drive rehearsing a version of her story that didn't sound like failure. "First time," I said under my breath, recognizing the precise combination of shame, fear, and raw resolve that marked nearly every newcomer. "I'll talk to her after." That had become my rhythm. Let them settle. Let them hear. Let them know this was a space where no one would ask how you let it happen, only how you wanted to begin again. The past 6 months had stripped away every illusion I'd once held about family and loyalty and the limits of what people were capable of. I'd listened to stories so painful they left the room in stunned silence. Children who'd stolen homes from under their parents' feet. Grandkids who'd maxed out credit cards, bankrupted checking accounts. Spouses who'd drained accounts while their partners were recovering from surgery. And yet, there was more than sorrow in those stories. There was resilience. I'd watched people rebuild. I'd watched women in their 70s learn to pay bills online, open new accounts, say no with pride. I'd watched men who hadn't spoken in the first 3 meetings offer rides home by the 5th. I'd seen healing, stubborn and beautiful, take root. And then there was Lillian. At this point, she was practically folklore. 17 protective trusts established. 2 elder abuse cases prosecuted. Nearly $200,000 recovered. She didn't come to every meeting, but her presence lived in every form we handed out. Every survivor, she helped put a firewall between themselves and the people who once called them mom or dad or sweetheart. I stood up and the room quieted. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady, full, not the clipped politeness I'd once used as armor, but the grounded confidence I'd earned one hard moment at a time. "For our newcomers, I'm Abigail Marlowe. And this." I looked around the room at the faces I now knew so well. Maxine, Rosa, Janet, the man who'd once been a CPA until his wife's sister stole his retirement fund. The young woman caring for a grandmother whose adult children kept demanding loans that were never repaid. This is our weekly gathering for people who've experienced financial exploitation by family members. The words always caught slightly in my throat, but the pain they carried now was clean, like pressing on a scar that no longer bled. I'd learned to own my story, to say it without apology, to wield it not as a warning, but as a lifeline to those still drifting in the fog of betrayal. "Tonight," I said, offering the woman near the door a small, welcoming smile, "we're going to talk about what comes after." I continued. "After you've protected yourself, after you've set boundaries, after you've stopped the immediate threat, what comes next?" It was the kind of question I could finally answer without hesitation, because I had lived it. The days and weeks after Franco's had been about damage control, trusts, attorneys, cutting off access, making sure nothing else could be taken. But that was just the surface work. The real work came in the quiet. In the mornings when I drank my coffee alone and didn't check my phone for a text from Abigail. In the evenings when I sat with the silence and tried not to fill it with guilt or anger. That was when I began to rebuild something I hadn't realized I'd lost: trust in myself. "For me," said Eddie Chase, leaning forward in his chair, "what came next was realizing I could live alone and like it." He was 78, a retired history teacher whose daughter had spent years draining his retirement account under the guise of managing his bills. He hadn't wanted to press charges. He just wanted peace. And now he had it. There were nods around the circle. That sentiment, independence, was a common thread among us. But not the kind born of bitterness or exile. This was chosen solitude. There was power in choosing your own company over the company of people who hurt you. "I learned I didn't have to forgive anyone," said Sheila Phelps, her voice clear and calm. She'd been with our group the longest after me. Her son had stolen her identity, opened a half-dozen credit cards, and left her thousands in debt. He said he needed it to get back on his feet. She'd said nothing for years, until she found herself at a payday loan center, trying to pay a minimum balance. "That was big for me," Sheila went on. "Everyone kept saying I had to forgive him because he was family. But Dr. Johnson helped me understand that forgiveness isn't mandatory for healing. Mitchell, my son, he'd become something of a visiting expert for our group, once a month, sometimes more. His medical background lent credibility, but it was his empathy that made people listen. He could explain trauma and boundaries and survival in ways that didn't make anyone feel small for falling victim. His insights had helped me reframe my own story. The guilt I'd carried over Abigail, that wasn't proof I'd failed as a mother. It was a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. "What about you, Abigail?" asked Carolyn Franklin, one of our newest regulars. "What came after for you?" There was no avoiding the question, and I didn't want to. These people, this group, they'd seen me through the worst of it. They'd earned honesty. I took a breath and looked around the circle. I saw resilience in every seat. "Purpose," I said, the word landing with more certainty than I expected. For 40 years, my purpose was being a wife and a mother. After Howard died, I thought my purpose was protecting what we built so I could pass it on to my children. But what came after was discovering that my real purpose might be protecting other people's mothers from what I went through. And it was true. What started as volunteer work had turned into a consulting role. Lillian had begun sending referrals my way. Older women blindsided by the betrayal of their own children, their spouses, their siblings. I'd found I had a talent for spotting patterns, for hearing the manipulation under the charm. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was helping others survive, too. "How do you handle the sadness?" asked the new woman, her voice breaking through the silence that followed my words. Everyone looked at her. It was her first time speaking. She was polished, articulate, but behind her composure was something raw. Her eyes held the dull sheen of someone who'd only recently realized her world had shifted under her feet. "How do you stop missing who they used to be?" The question pierced something soft inside me. Because I did miss Abigail. Not the woman who'd tried to leverage my love into a down payment, but the girl who used to bring me dandelions. The one who called me from college in tears after her first breakup. The daughter who beamed when I showed up at her graduation in that burgundy dress. "I don't think you stop missing them," I said gently. "I think you learn to mourn them while protecting yourself from them. It's possible to grieve someone who's still alive." It was the most painful truth I'd ever had to learn, and perhaps the most liberating. The meeting went on. We talked about new laws coming into effect, shared some updates on former members who had moved away, started new lives. Laughed a little, cried a little. It was always that way. But her question lingered. It stayed with me all the way home to my little duplex where Janet had beaten me back, as usual. She was already at the stove, ladling leftover soup into mismatched bowls. "How was group?" she asked as I shrugged off my coat. "Good," I said. Then, after a beat, hard, a new woman asked about missing the people our families used to be. Janet's expression didn't change. She just nodded slowly, like she'd expected it. At 67, she'd been through her own reckoning. Her children, grown, employed, articulate, had tried to talk her into selling her home. Not because she was ill, not because she needed assistance, but because they wanted access to her equity. Her solution had been to move into the duplex next to mine and inform them, without a trace of apology, that their inheritance was now being spent on her happiness. "Speaking of missing people," Janet said, carefully watching my reaction. "Mitchell called. Abigail had her baby." The words landed like a stone to the chest. Even though I'd known this moment was coming, Mitchell had kept me quietly informed throughout the pregnancy. Hearing it out loud made it real. A granddaughter. I remembered the timing from Mitchell's earlier calculations. Late October. And now she was here. "How is she?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure who I meant, Abigail or the baby. "Everyone's healthy," Janet said. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. They named her Eliza. Eliza, my mother's name. The manipulation was so obvious, so transparent, that for a moment I felt dizzy from it. I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Of all the names they could have chosen, why that one? There was only one answer. Abigail was trying to reach back, tug at roots, cloak her actions in sentiment. "Mitchell said Abigail asked him to call you," Janet continued. "She wanted you to know that visiting hours are flexible, and that she'd very much like to see you." I sat there in silence, the weight of it all pressing down. My instincts warred with my experience. Some old, soft part of me, tattered but not entirely destroyed, ached to rush to the hospital, to hold the baby, to pretend we were a family untouched by betrayal. But I'd learned not to trust that voice. Not blindly. I'd learned to interrogate my emotional reflexes, to pause before acting, to look for the line between love and manipulation. "What do you think she wants?" I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said aloud. Janet didn't hesitate. "I think she wants to use that baby to reopen negotiations about the trust." It was probably true. Since Franco's, Abigail hadn't stopped trying to reach me. Cards, messages passed through Mitchell, and accidental encounters at the places I frequented. Each one wrapped in civility but carrying the same subtext. "We could fix this if I just made some changes. If I just became flexible about certain financial matters." "The baby isn't responsible for her parents' choices," I murmured, a truth I wanted to cling to. "No, she's not," Janet agreed. "But you're not responsible for protecting yourself from her parents' choices either." That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the baby. Eliza, a girl who might grow up never knowing me. Or worse, knowing only a version of me filtered through resentment and bitterness. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend none of this had happened. The next morning, I called Lillian. "I've been expecting this call," she said without even a hello. "Abigail had the baby." She did. I took a breath. "And now I have to decide what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" she asked, her tone direct and clear, cutting through the noise in my head. That question. I'd been circling it ever since Janet told me. What did I want? Not what Abigail wanted. Not what Mitchell thought was right. Not what the world expected of a grandmother. Me. "I want to meet my granddaughter," I said slowly, tasting the words. "But I want to do it on my terms. With clear boundaries. And without opening myself up to manipulation." "That's possible," Lillian said without hesitation. "We can arrange supervised visits through Mitchell. We can set clear protocols, what topics are off limits, what behaviors will end visits, what consequences follow if boundaries are violated." I exhaled, already feeling more grounded. "And if Abigail refuses those terms," Lillian continued, "then you'll know exactly where you stand with her. And more importantly, you'll know you protected yourself while leaving the door open for a genuine relationship, if she ever chooses to walk through it." That afternoon, I drafted a letter to my daughter. Not the furious tirade I'd composed and torn up in my mind over the past months. Not the raw, aching plea I'd sometimes imagined sending in moments of weakness. This one was different. Clear, calm, unflinching. A letter not written in anger, but in certainty. I sat at the dining room table, pen in hand, and let the words come. "Abigail," I began. "I would very much like to meet Eliza and to have a relationship with her as she grows." Even writing her name on the page stirred something in me, tender and complicated. My granddaughter. A new life untouched by all this history. However, Any contact between us must respect the boundaries I've established for my own well-being. I paused, letting the ink dry as I breathed in the weight of what I was asking, not just for space, but for integrity. I am willing to visit with Eliza in Mitchell's presence for limited periods with the understanding that any attempt to discuss the trust, my financial decisions, or past grievances will end the visit immediately. The pen didn't hesitate. These weren't threats. These were terms. Survival terms. Peace terms. If you can accept these terms, please have Mitchell arrange our first meeting. If you cannot, I hope you'll reconsider when you're ready to prioritize Eliza's relationship with her grandmother over your relationship with my money. There it was, the truth, laid bare. I will always love the daughter you were. My hand shook slightly, not from regret, but from the effort of acknowledging the fracture without letting it consume me. I am no longer available to be victimized by the person you've chosen to become. I sat back and reread the letter twice. Not once did I flinch from its contents. No apologies. No justifications. Only clarity and care in equal measure. With hope for your growth and boundaries for my protection. Mom. I signed it, folded it, and slid it into an envelope before I could second-guess myself. Then I stood, walked out the front door, and made the short trip to the mailbox. Each step felt like a reclaiming. I slipped the letter into the slot and let it go with the satisfaction of someone who had finally learned the difference between giving up and setting terms. The future was still unwritten, but this time, it would be written by me, with my own pen, in my own voice. And if my granddaughter wanted to be part of that story, she would be welcomed with love, wisdom, and the fierce protection of a grandmother who'd learned that the greatest gift you can give a child is the example of a woman who cannot be moved. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.